Good Shabbos, everyone. So before I begin, I want to apologize if my words tonight make some of you uncomfortable. And I'm confident that in my attempts to please everyone, I will please no one. But please know, this is not an endorsement of any particular candidate. Who you vote for in any election is none of my business. But as a rabbi, there are times I must be completely honest with my thoughts when it comes to the security of our Jewish nation. And in my lifetime, Israel has never been in a more precarious position. So here it goes. If I had the chance right now to have a one-on-one meeting with President Joe Biden. President Biden, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for the invitation to the White House for this one-on-one meeting. Coming from Houston, I wanted to first present you a C.J. Strauss jersey, an Alex Bregman autograph signed baseball, a Benji Levitt's famous Mom's chocolate cake. You may remember you got it a few years ago when you were here in Houston. Oh, and here's a gift card to Kenny and Ziggy's next time you're in town. Now, thank Jill for making me that wonderful kosher dinner. It's almost as good as the kosher food my wife makes at home. So it's about time, President Joe Biden, that you asked to meet with me. Now, I don't mean this out of a sense of entitlement or overconfidence. Rather, President Biden, I think in many ways I represent the mainstream Jewish voter. And I want to present what's on my mind. And I believe on most American Jews. Many of them, like my members, I believe, feel in many respects the same way I do right now. President, as you have fondly recalled many times, I know you met with Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, back in 1973. I was one at the time. Sorry, I couldn't resist. You met her on the eve of the Yom Kippur War. And with Golda Meir at your side, you toured Israel's borders as she showed you why Israel's situation was so dire. And you were incredibly impressed by Golda, but you became visibly depressed about Israel's chances of survival. But Golda Meir told you not to worry, reminding you that Israel has a secret weapon in her conflict with the Arabs. Israelis have nowhere else to go. And you called the meeting with her one of the most important meetings you've ever had in your political life. And now for over 50 years, you have understood Israel is truly a David fighting against a Goliath, and why Israel must continue to have America's backing in order to survive. President Biden, in your decades of public service, you have often supported Israel and spoken out in her favor. Over the years, I've had the pleasure of hearing you many, many times at AIPAC conferences. And since the 1970s, you've always stood with AIPAC and the state of Israel. And you've made me proud as an American leader who has empathized with Israel's situation. And after October 7th, Mr. President, you also made me proud. Just days after that attack, you reminded the world that Israel is not alone. You moved 2 carrier groups to protect the Jewish state when she needed it most. And as the most powerful man in the world, you said repeatedly, I don't believe you had to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I am a Zionist. Even conservative leaders in Israel and Republican politicians in the United States praised you. In your support of Israel, you united many Americans from both parties. Maybe Israel is the way to unite this country. But Mr. President, I have to also tell you, you brought comfort to Jews across the world. And you gave reassurance to those who need it most, Israelis, by doing something even more remarkable. You became the first American president to travel to Israel during a time of war. It's never happened before. And you embraced Israelis, not just the prime minister and other elected leaders. You met with Israelis, those mourning the loss of their loved ones and the families of the hostages. Your words of strength and consolation took away some of their unimaginable pain. Mr. President, you showed a sense of empathy and compassion that I believe is the best you've always been about. Your words and actions came from your genuine appreciation and love for the state of Israel. Again, you demonstrated that you are a Zionist. And your popularity rating in Israel was sky high. I'm sure you wish you were running for re-election there. President Biden, here comes the hard part. I have to be honest. Over the last several weeks, something has changed. A subtle shift in your words and actions began during your State of the Union address a month ago. Your speech criticized Israel's attempts of humanitarian assistance. There was no nuance. You claimed that Israel was using humanitarian assistance as a bargaining chip, overlooking the fact that Hamas and numerous criminal gangs in Gaza routinely steal much of the aid Israel was providing. Your administration, a few weeks later, then abstained instead of vetoing a United Nations Security Council resolution, a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza without making the ceasefire contingent of Hamas releasing the Israeli hostages. There was a clear policy shift to put increasing pressure on Israel instead of on the terrorists. And then last week, after Israel's accidental and tragic attack against a World Central Kitchen convoy, your administration further amped up the heat. And these days, it's much more common to hear you and your officials express your frustrations with Israel, and less common to hear any public pressure put on the terrorists. Now this week, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller made clear your administration is ruling out an Israeli invasion of Rafah under any circumstances, raising doubts whether you and the United States still support the complete removal of Hamas from power. And to top it off, Mr. President, in an interview you gave this week, you called for Israel to just declare a 6-week ceasefire without the return of any hostages. I know your advisors quickly cleaned up the mess you made, saying you meant to tie your call for a ceasefire to the release of hostages. But the damage was done. And it's no wonder Hamas has still not agreed to a ceasefire, release any hostages at all. Why should they? You've put all the pressure on Israel. If I was Hamas, I too would wait for your administration to compel Israel to do even more, so I could eke out a few more concessions. Mr. President, you're better than that. It's not that I want you to stand with the democratic country in its time of need. That's not all I want you to do. I want you to be smarter, better. There are hostages who are injured, babies, women who are having unspeakable things being done to them. Some of them are fellow Americans. And you're putting all the pressure these days on Israel. And do you know how painful that is for me and my people, for Israelis, for the families of the hostages? And focusing the attention on Israel's actions, you've made Bibi Netanyahu the great enemy of the world. And I know he's far from perfect. I could give a few sermons about Bibi. But he is the duly elected leader of Israel. And while he is deeply unpopular in Israel, even if he resigned tomorrow, Israel's aims and its conduct in this war, this justifiable war, would not noticeably change. Because Israelis and most Jews around the world are united in getting their people back and removing Hamas from power. And they need the full support of the most powerful person in the world. Now, President Biden, I'm not done. It's obvious why you've changed your tone. And I even understand it. You're down in the polls. And in places like Michigan, with its large American Arab population, you're concerned about losing their votes. And I get it. Their voices are disruptive and they're loud. But don't you think it's magnified just a bit by the mainstream media who's often hostile to Israel? Yes, I know 13% of voters voted uncommitted in February's Michigan primary, but 11% voted the same way back in 2012 when President Obama was running for re-election. And we don't even know why those people voted uncommitted. It may not be about Israel. And look, I understand it's not just about Arab Americans. There are many progressive voters who are also threatening to sit out the election to protest your support for Israel. So I know you have advisors who are telling you that you need to get tough with Israel, perhaps even abandon Israel in a great time of need. The first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, said a long time ago, long wars will never be good for Israel. She will eventually lose support of the world. So, Mr. President, I do appreciate that you have stood with Israel for many difficult months, more than most American presidents ever did. President Nixon gave Israel just 3 weeks in that Yom Kippur War of 1973. George W. Bush, a big supporter of Israel, only gave Israel 5 weeks in 2006 with its war with Hezbollah. And President Obama gave Israel just 6 weeks in another war with Hamas in 2014. You've given Israel over 6 months. And I also know the images coming out of Gaza are not good. I too, like most American Jews, we feel for the suffering of innocent Palestinians. It's terrible. Yet I believe, Mr. President, you still understand, that the blame has to be on Hamas. You know Hamas fights from hospitals and schools behind its people while they rest and eat well in their 450 miles of underground tunnels. They allow their innocent people to suffer above ground. Because Hamas regards every death of a Palestinian as a PR victory. And yes, Israel can and should get even more aid into Gaza. So they are. But the problem is that Hamas often uses the distribution of food as a weapon. And they're the ones who don't get it to the poor people who deserve and need it the most. That is why we all know, if Hamas truly cared about its people and their welfare and wanted to prevent future tragedies and further loss of life, it would immediately, without delay, lay down its arms and unconditionally release all the hostages. There's no justification. And with all due respect, Mr. President, I don't hear you present these facts to the world any longer. If you don't maintain your clear and principled defense of Israel that was evident in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, you risk Israel's ability to win this war. I implore you, Mr. President, please remind the world who Israel is fighting. Call upon the leaders of the world to join you and recognize the nefarious, malicious evil that is Hamas, and of how important it is to all who cherish freedom and value our way of life that they must be defeated. Remind people of the purpose and goals of Hamas, who started this war, and why Israel continues to fight. A clear moral voice like yours is desperately needed at this time. Don't give hope to Hamas to hold out for a better deal, which only serves to prolong the fighting. Now is the time, Mr. President, to provide the leadership, to provide the moral clarity you did for the first 5 months of this awful but justified war on Hamas. Don't give up on Israel now, because your change in tone is giving the activist left outsized control of your administration's foreign policy. And Mr. President, don't forget, no matter how hard you may try, you can never appease the extreme left, because the extreme left wing of your base will never be satisfied until Israel is defeated for good. Stand by your principles. Stand by what is right. Stand by what I believe is your genuine love for the Jewish nation. Don't be a typical politician who only cares about trying to get more votes. But let me also warn you, don't take the mainstream Jewish voters for granted. We Jews and many friends, we also vote. And our votes in cities like Detroit and Milwaukee, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia can also swing this election. So thank you, Mr. President, for this invitation. It's been a true honor to sit in the Oval Office with you. And I hope you will still have me back someday. But most importantly, you've always been a friend of the Jewish people. Thank you for all that you have done for the state of Israel. Because without American support, Israel cannot defeat Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, ISIS, Islamic Jihad, Syria, and of course Iran, who could attack Israel this Shabbat. I know it's hard to believe, Mr. President. As successful and as strong as Israel is, her situation is just like it was in 1973 when you first met Golda Meir. Israel is still the David fighting the Goliath. Shabbat Shalom.